My name is Nader Hashemi. I'm the director of the new Center for Middle East Studies. I also teach Middle East and Islamic politics here. And I want to extend to everyone a very warm welcome to this first session of our Syria conference called Surviving the Syrian Civil War, a roundtable discussion on civil resistance and the politics of violence, which is really the kickoff session for our two-day international conference, officially titled Resolving the Syrian Crisis, hosted by our Center for Middle East Studies here at the Josef Korbel School of International Studies here at the University of Denver. We have a very ambitious sort of two-day conference planned, 5 panels. This is the first one, exploring all dimensions and aspects of the tragic conflict in Syria. But before we begin, I want to take just a brief moment to acknowledge the hard work of our co-sponsors and the people who've been responsible for supporting this particular project. The C Center for International Security and Diplomacy, the Conflict Resolution Institute, the Center for Rights and Development. In addition, I want to thank Ved Nanda's Center for International Comparative Law at the DU Law School. I want to thank DU's Department of Religious Studies, which is a co-sponsor of this conference. And beyond this institutional support, we've been fortunate to receive the help of several hardworking staff members here at the Korbel School: Jennifer Thompson, Tiffany Hutchins, Janet Roll, Lily Siegel-Gardner-Coleman, Emily Hinga, Alicia Kirkaby, Ann Irving, Kenda Grimm, and Professor Andrea Stanton in the Department of Religious Studies. Thanks to everyone for their hard work and making this project a success. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to the moderator for this first session, my colleague Tamra Pearson. She is the Henry Luce Professor of Conflict Resolution and the co-director of the Conflict Resolution Institute here at the Korbel School. She's also the director of the Center for Research and Practice in Korbel's Conflict Resolution Program, and she will introduce tonight's speakers.
Thank you, Nader. Can you hear okay if I stay here? Okay. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and introduce both speakers now so that we can have a bit of continuity as we go forward into both having the presentations and then having a discussion afterwards. So our main speaker is Oliver Kaplan. He is a lecturer here at the Josef Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. He was a postdoctoral research associate at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School and also an affiliate of Stanford's Empirical Studies of Conflict Project. His book project, Civilian Autonomy in Civil War, examines how civilian communities organize to protect themselves from wartime violence. He's conducted fieldwork in Colombia and the Philippines, and his research has been published in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, Journal of Peace Research, the New York Times, Foreign Policy, and the National Interest. Kristin Gillespie will be our respondent. Kristin is a TV, radio, and print journalist who's been based in Syria and Jordan for the last decade, covering stories from Egypt to Yemen, including the Lebanon, Israel, and Iraq wars. She's reported for NPR, USA Today, The Nation, and the Daily Star of Lebanon. She now heads the English news website for the Syrian opposition channel, Syria Al-Sha'ab, which operates a virtual group newsroom via Skype, whereby citizen journalists inside Syria and Jordan post videos and news items from all over Syria and communicate about the country's future. So I'm looking forward to hearing from both of our speakers. I'm going to turn it first over to Oliver Kaplan.
Great, thank you very much, Tamra. And I'd like to thank everyone who put this on, and especially the guys at the Middle East Center who I saw toiling away for many months, pulling this together, inviting a bunch of amazing speakers from all over the world. So I'd like to give a special thanks to Nader, Danny, and also especially Doug, who we know did all the work in the background. So thank you very much. So I'd like to just say it's really an honor to participate in such a high-powered conference on such an important topic. So I really do feel it's a privilege for me to be able to share some of the research I've been doing on Syria. But I want to say that I think the organizers of this conference may have made a big mistake, because I'm not a Syrianist. I'm not a Syria scholar, and I've never been to Syria. But I think that through my work on conflict studies in other countries, I have some interesting insights that will apply to Syria based on some of my previous research. So for that reason, as not being a Syria scholar, I am very humbled to be here among such a high-powered crowd of people who are deeply involved in the Syrian conflict and studying it and trying to improve the situation in that country. So I'd like just to thank all the colleagues who are here who are contributing very valuable insights, which I think we're all very fortunate to have here in Denver. So thank you for that. So today in my presentation, I'm going to talk about surviving the Syrian civil war. And as part of the presentation, I'm going to actually try to sort of do a little bit of stage setting for the entire conference and give a bit of an overview of what are the problems that we're seeing in Syria, and then go on to some of the research findings that I have on Syria. So to begin, I have seen more or less three main issues that come up again and again in our discussions on Syria. So one is protecting civilians, which is probably the one that people feel most passionate about and see most gruesomely in the press and in print. The second issue that we're going to be talking about is ending the Assad regime, which is arguably inarguably, I should say, a very abusive regime. But this also brings up the question of aiding rebels and how this should be done. And then third, there's the question of post-conflict. The post-conflict question is a question that we haven't quite arrived at yet, but a lot of people feel like we will soon, and so a lot of the discussions and other panels are going to be discussing this issue. An interesting thing about all three of these topics is that civilians play very important roles through protesting and organizing in all of these processes. And to date, the focus that we've seen in the press and among pundits and discussants has been on international solutions to the Syrian problem. But as we know, this has been a long time coming, and that international responses has been weak. So I'm just going to detail for a moment some of the failed international responses that we've been waiting for to take hold and to make a difference. There have been many of them from all across the spectrum trying to do anything to solve this crisis. So no-fly zones, safe zones and safe corridors for civilians, military interventions, UN observers and peacekeepers, ceasefires which have been attempted to be negotiated and failed, support for the rebels to end the regime more quickly, and even invoking the responsibility to protect, to implore international actors to do something to protect civilians. Of course, none of these have come to fruition or actually functioned to protect civilians, or not in a significant way. R2P is nowhere to be found. There's casualty aversion among international actors. There's a fear of resistance and outside actors taking action if international and Western powers were to do something. There's also the fear of spillovers to other countries and chemical weapons. So all this has produced a lot of inaction by international actors. So my argument is a little different. And obviously, and without a doubt, there's been massive suffering in Syria. Many civilians have suffered violence, displacement, lack of food, the harsh winter, a number of things. But I also, in this presentation, I'm going to draw attention to a sub-narrative, and a sub-narrative that hasn't been well reported on, and that is civilian efforts to survive the conflict. So this is going to throw our thinking on its head a little bit and introduce a new approach and hopefully rethink a little bit what is possible in terms of solutions to at least address the first point that I mentioned, which is protecting civilians. So interestingly, in Syria, civilians have had their own protection strategies. Some of these strategies have stemmed from the nonviolent protest strategies that we saw in the early days of the revolution, and some have evolved later. So the information that I'm going to present is all from secondhand reporting. I've never been to Syria. I'm trying to give a fair disclaimer here. Other people are going to be able to give a better insight on some of the points I make. So I'm relying on the secondhand reporting of intrepid journalists, activists, bloggers, and other observers. But what I've been able to see is that while violence has been severe many civilians have also been able to survive. And even though there's been little international assistance, I think it's worthwhile considering a bottom-up approach to this issue. So interestingly, many Syrians are ambivalent about the conflict and overall would like to avoid it. And I'm going to argue that local cohesion and institutions are one way to help them do that and help them manage their communities and try to deal with the conflict. So I think what will happen, or the goal of my presentation, is to put together enough cases of this where we start to see a pattern that we'll actually believe. And at first, I didn't think I would find sufficient cases to make a presentation on this topic, but they kept coming, and now I've convinced even myself. So these civilians are doing more than just survive. They're trying to reach a post-conflict situation while avoiding suffering. So just to give a brief overview of where I'm going. So briefly, I'm going to talk about the violence in Syria. I'm going to introduce a theory of civilian autonomy, which I've documented in other countries as well as in Syria. I'm going to provide several examples of how civilians have organized to deal with violence. And I'm going to provide three main examples here. I have four on the screen, but one is intersectarian harmony. So how do people of different sects and religions cooperate and avoid violence together? One is minority group cohesion. So how do ethnic and religious minorities themselves deal with violence? A third one is early warning systems, which activists and others have been able to create. And the fourth is local coordinating committees, which are actually a political arm of the revolution, but have also played important roles in protecting civilians. I'm not going to focus that much on those today because later in the conference there are others that are far more better qualified to talk about that issue than I. So, and then I'll briefly conclude with some final insights. So just to begin with the topic of violence, you can basically characterize the violence that has occurred in Syria into four main kinds of violence. So one is the most obvious, that there's been a lot of repression as well as retaliation by government forces, including retaliation against rebel-occupied neighborhoods and villages. So rebels may occupy a village or neighborhood, and then the regime retaliates against that neighborhood relatively indiscriminately, so artillery bombing, etc. Another is that Alawite Shabiha paramilitaries are targeting rebel supporters and would-be rebels to eliminate them and coerce them to desist from supporting the revolution. A third kind is abusive and possibly coercive or undisciplined rebel groups. So the Free Syrian Army and other rebel groups that are operating in Syria. Some are Islamist, some are just undisciplined, but they end up committing abuses or at least instilling fear in civilians. A fourth one is sectarian disputes. So local actors taking advantage of the conflict to settle their own scores, perhaps against people from other sects or other ethnic groups, perhaps not. So it's interesting that Syria, up until the revolution, was hailed as a model of intersectarian harmony among minorities. At least that's what the historical consensus was. And now supposedly all these sects are breaking down and fighting each other in different ways. But I think what we'll find is that that's not the entire story, that there are also positive examples of sects continuing to cooperate and that legacy of harmony continuing even through the conflict. So I've been able to put together some quantitative evidence on patterns of violence, and this is just a brief summary. I hope everyone can see it. This shows some of the main patterns of violence that occurred up through October 2012. This is mainly killings of civilians, and it also does not include forced displacement of civilians or refugees or other kinds of abuse, but it shows some striking patterns that this data shows 37,000 killings. New UN data shows over 60,000 killings of civilians. And some of the main forms here are gunshot wounds and artillery and airstrikes. And the airstrikes can be thought of that indiscriminate retaliation that I listed as one of the forms of violence. So the civilians here, they're wary of taking sides, but still facing high levels of violence. So I've also been able to map this data geographically using a GIS program. And as you can see, there's actually variation in violence as severe as it's been. So you can see there's been some major violence in the western more populated areas around the major cities of Aleppo, Damascus, Hama, and Homs, where a lot of the revolution has been taking place. There's also some violence in the eastern plain regions, where some of the Arab tribes and other minorities live. But as you can see, there's also variation in violence. So some areas are white with little violence, and some had more violence. And so one question that this begs is whether or not these patterns are due to armed groups simply contesting some areas more than others, or not contesting some areas, or if there are other factors at play, including civilian movements or other geographical or other factors involved. So, of course, I'm going to argue that there's evidence to believe that the civilians themselves are doing something positive to deal with violence. As a comparison, this is the map of population in Syria by Naya or by town. And as you can see, if you go back and forth, you can see that some of the populated areas also had high levels of violence, but some did not. So there is some variation there. I think this actually becomes more interesting and apparent when you look at the overall numbers of the Syrian conflict. So I've done my best to put together a demographic overview of the Syrian civil war. I'm hoping everyone can see the data here. I put together a table that includes the overall population of Syria, the adult population, the estimated size of the combatants, and the estimated effects of the conflict on civilians. So this includes things like killings, displacements within the country, as well as refugees. It obviously doesn't include every kind of damage that could occur against civilians, such as injuries or torture or lack of food or water, those kinds of things. But it does capture, I think, the direct effect that the conflict has had on Syrian civilians. And as you can see, these numbers are quite high and quite staggering. We know from the news from UN High Commission for Refugees, from other organizations, that up to possibly 2 million civilians have been displaced within the country, and another 500,000 have been displaced within Syria. The estimate from the UN is that 60,000 civilians have been killed. The interesting thing, and the point that I'd like to make, is that even if you take all these numbers into account in the severity of the conflict, many civilian Syrians actually have not been directly affected by the conflict. And this is actually true in most conflicts. And so I've done some calculations, and you can see here that whether you're trying to cut the data by the total number of civilians or the number of adults, millions of people, in fact, many more millions than the total number of civilians that were affected by the conflict have not been affected, at least according to this data. And so you can see the civilians affected are somewhere around 3 million. The estimated number of civilians unaffected, somewhere around 18 million. Now, we can debate these numbers, but probably the overall point is somehow true. Whether these people are living in uncontested areas or somehow getting by in contested areas is still a question. And we, of course, need to acknowledge that there is a lot of poor counting in conflict zones, especially with fogs of war, et cetera. And in fact, the violence data that I showed you is not necessarily only for civilians. It may include combatants as well. There's been a very poor job of trying to distinguish between civilians and combatants harmed by the conflict in this data. But this data actually speaks to an interesting point. One, there may be some restraint by some of the armed groups, as bad as the conflict has been. And second, many civilians do form what Stephen Starr, one of our panelists, has called a silent majority. And as he quotes someone from his book, then he says, one of the respondents says, quote, "Then there is the silent majority, the silent 90%. They couldn't care less. They want to go on with their daily lives. But it must be said, if this 90% cannot go on with their lives, they may turn one way or another." So the question then is how to get by. So in this case, I'm documenting perhaps more of an 82% silent majority, but it's still quite a big majority. So these are the two numbers that I was contrasting here with the red arrows. So just to put a theoretical framework on this, Civilians often are not widely passionate for revolutionary movements, and in part because they're afraid of violence. So in the case of Syria, probably a good majority of people are anti-regime and pro-democracy, but they're fearful of the consequences of the conflict or would simply prefer to resolve the political differences peacefully. There is what you could say the vocal majority that's causing a lot of the violence. And so the question is, how can these people that have these kinds of preferences, how can they get by? And in fact, you hear a quote from a recent article where a man in Syria, an elderly man leaving Syria, said, "It's all nonsense. Neither the Free Syrian Army nor Assad's forces can protect us. The two factions are fighting each other, but no one is dying except the innocent, the children, the women, the elderly." And so the question is, what helps these civilians? And my argument is that local cohesion and local institutions are key for giving these civilians a chance to survive. In Syria, I've come across three main types of local cohesion. There are probably more. I hope the Syria experts in the room and throughout the conference will be able to help clarify this, but I've seen that tribal structures are very important, various agricultural cooperatives, as well as different sectarian and ethnic organizations have been leveraged. And these organizations help solve important collective action problems to deal with violence, and they do so in a number of ways. So one, they can prevent disputes and avoid retaliation. Next, they can help continue a dialogue and advocate for the neutrality of specific populations so that these populations do not get taken up into the macro conflict. Third, these organizations can help provide early warning for residents so residents themselves can avoid impending battles. Where am I? Fourth, fifth. These organizations, to the extent that they can prevent conflict, can also play important roles as receptor communities so that people fleeing conflict from nearby areas have a safe haven to go to. And sixth, these organizations play an important role in post-conflict and providing civilian order in the absence of the state. So once the battle is over and macro-level institutions have not yet been established, local-level organizations play an important role in policing, restraining civilian governance to restrain people with weapons, and generally limit violence and provide order. But these kinds of organizations cannot be expected to perform well under all conditions. There are certain scope conditions and limitations. So when violence is highly intense, we may not expect these organizations to survive long, or when violence endures for a long time, there may be limits to when these organizations can be effective. But the hope is that civilians acting peacefully can hopefully reach the time without suffering to where they get to post-conflict. So they can sort of get through the conflict without suffering harm. And this becomes all the more believable in Syria when I show you this next slide, where civilians have taken their own security into their hands across the world to try to protect themselves and stay out of civil conflicts. So Syria is not unique. I've documented this as a generalized phenomenon. So I think that makes Syria a little less surprising. And indeed, I've documented peace communities in Colombia, peace zones in the Philippines, communities rejecting the Taliban in Afghanistan, local leaders rejecting Muslim extremists, Islamist extremists in Russia, in Dagestan. The Las Abejas movement trying to protect civilians from paramilitaries and rebel forces in Mexico. The Cao Dai in Vietnam, the Arrow Boys and other local forces in Congo, and even the Naprama movement, which was a mystical movement that protected civilians in Mozambique. So, in fact, almost a quarter of countries see some kind of civilian movement to try to protect civilians. And in Syria, it's been quite broad. Now I'm going to go through a few examples in Syria. And I'd like to start with one that is particularly well documented, given how poor the overall documentation of these cases are. And this one, oftentimes, well, not oftentimes, but when these cases are documented, they are referred to as oases of some sort or havens of intersectarian harmony. The problem is that these cases are not well reported on because a lot of the attention of journalists and observers has to do with conflict and violence and not cases where conflict is not occurring or where the dog is not barking. But so this is a very interesting case here of the town of Maaloula, which is a historical Christian town, which also has a diverse Muslim population, remaining one of the few remaining communities where Aramaic is speaking, so in some ways special, but they also have some very interesting examples. So they have some interesting religious institutions that work together and cooperate well. And one example of these is the convent there, the Christian convent of St. Takla, which has a lot of nuns that are very active in that community. But also they have a strong Muslim leader as well. And an interesting quote from a New York Times coverage of this article, the Sunni imam of the town said this: "Early on in this war, I met with the main religious leaders in the community, the bishop, the mother superior of the main convent. We decided that even if the mountains around us were exploding with fighting, we would not go to war. There was no war here in Maaloula. Here, we all know each other. Here in these mountains are all different people, different religions, but we decided adamantly that Maaloula would not be destroyed." So everyone there seems to support each other. And a question is how successful this has been, which is hard to verify. But undoubtedly, this is occurring in other countries, albeit perhaps less well documented. One other example I've come across is the town of Yabrood, which is in somewhat close proximity to Maaloula. And here you can see the headline directly. It says, "In Syria, an oasis from the war." Now, in Yabrood, they seem like they had more stronger preferences for the revolution, but they still wanted to be nonviolent and avoid conflict. And so in this case, although there was a quick rebel advance before that time, the unity of Christians and Muslims seem to have played an important role to avoid intersectarian disputes and killings. So for example, one man from this community said, "The regime wants us to fear Muslims, but I don't fear my brothers," said one Christian resident. He said, the Christian resident. Another man, talking about a killing or a kidnapping by Shabiha, said in that case that we did not react strongly to that because we did not want to bring war here. So sort of cautious moves to avoid drawing sides into the conflict. Sorry, that was a case of theft. I got confused there. So those are some examples. There are also many interesting examples that I've documented from ethno and religious minority groups. So minority group cohesion playing an important role to try to avoid taking part in the conflict and avoiding violence. And so these people are often afraid of the regime based on the retaliation that it has carried out, but they're also afraid of potential extremist Islamists coming to power and causing problems as well. So it's important to note that the Assad regime has historically curried favor with some of these groups, and so some members of these groups do have strong affiliations for the regime. Some don't, some are changing, but there are still very important cohesions of these groups trying to protect their populations. So you can see some of the groups by population on this slide. Obviously, this slide does not discuss much the Sunni majority, which would be another interesting case to document. I haven't seen as much information about nonviolent movements there, but they likely exist. So a few headlines from these minorities, you can just see the kinds of tensions that they're facing and also the kinds of responses that they're making, including neutrality. So one is Syria's Assyrians caught in the middle. Another is Syria's Druze community, a silent minority in no rush to take sides. Another one about the Palestinians, Syria's Palestinians try to stay neutral amid turmoil. And then about the Arab tribes, who will the tribes back in Syria's civil war? So there is some interesting evidence there that these communities are taking interesting positions that we might not expect. So one interesting case that I could discuss is the case of the Armenians. So the Armenians are a small population in Syria, but they appear to be very cohesive and have made some interesting responses to the conflict. Some have armed in the city of Aleppo, but others have also united. And in fact, the Armenian leaders of 3 churches made a statement to clarify the position of the community. As the statement said here, quote, "As the bloodshed continues unabated, what adds to our anguish are the unsuccessful attempts of presenting the Syrian Armenians as taking part in armed battles of the crisis to drag them into a conflict. We reiterate today that the peaceful coexistence that the Syrian Armenians have cultivated throughout decades continues, and it will definitely stay against all kinds of violence and armed collisions. So that's an interesting quote of a very unified response. The question that we can answer as well is how well has this worked to manage the community, buy them protection? Unfortunately, there's not data to tell that. There is a lot of evidence that many Armenians have displaced from the country to go back to Armenia itself, but likely this cohesion played a role in protecting Armenians during the different battles. So this is not a very easy question to answer, but I'm able to throw a little bit of data at this question. And so I can look at the Christian homicide rate in Syria, again by nayas or by towns. And so this is a not very precisely calculated homicide rate. I can't tell you how precisely this is because I don't know how well the individuals were classified by religion. But apparently there are some areas where Christians have faced severe violence, but also, unfortunately I don't have the Christian population underlined on this map, but likely there are some communities that did not suffer as well. But one thing that you can note is, maybe you can see the scale on this map is much lower than the overall counts of violence, which suggests that Christians have suffered much less. This graph suggests as much. I can't guarantee that this is an accurate map, but as you'll see, much of the violence has been perpetrated against non-Christian minorities relative to Christian minorities, where the homicide rate is very minimal. I don't know if that's completely accurate, but it raises a provocative question as to why Christians are perhaps being attacked less. It could be because of their cohesion. It could be because of where they live. It could also be because of historic ties to the regime or certain preferences among armed groups to not target these civilians. But either way, the interesting point is that certain populations are able to get by without being severely harmed by the conflict. One last example I'd like to point to is an early warning system that I came across in news reporting, in that I'm sure some of the Syrian experts can speak to in more depth today, but this is a very interesting social cohesion-born process to basically provide information to civilians. So this is the Aleppo Today TV station, which is a activist-run pirate TV station that somehow manages to stay on the air and broadcast to civilians and residents in the region where battles are likely to take place or where they just occurred, so that civilians paying attention to this can themselves extricate themselves from harm, at least temporarily. So now I'm going to get toward my conclusion, but I'd like to show you one final graph of the conflict over time, and this is changing conflict conditions. So this is the number of killings over time, and as you can see, the conflict started out with a relatively moderate amount of violence, but has recently spiked a lot. I don't know if I 100% believe the decline that we see there, but we know that violence is continuing. But one thing is clear is that violence has gotten much worse than it has before. And so a question is, what do these conditions mean for how well civilians can rely on their local communities to avoid violence? So Syria tends to be a highly urban conflict and a highly militarized conflict with a well-formed military and also fairly well-armed rebel groups, although, as we know in the news, rebels have had shortages in arms as well. So there has been quite intense fighting, and as the conflict drags on, communities have to hold out for longer and longer amounts of time. And this has created the additional problems of having to get through cold winters and how to deal with deep dependencies on state institutions and services when these services fail to function and are pulled away. So food isn't distributed, prices go up. It makes it very hard for these communities to be self-sufficient. So there are definitely some limitations that I don't want to wash over. So we hope that these communities are not simply delaying the inevitable of some kind of displacement. I think so far the data that we've seen suggests that they are not. So one question this raises, though, is what difference would have international support made from the get-go for some of these local communities? Would they have had a better chance to avoid taking a part in the conflict, or would support from the outside have made them more resilient over the long term and the long duration of this conflict? So just to conclude with this presentation, I'd like to again draw our attention to the sub-narrative that I'm trying to point out. And hopefully I've been able to begin to establish a pattern of civilians actually trying to deal with violence on their own. The problem with looking at this pattern, as I mentioned, is that there's an extreme selection bias in our attention, where we focus on violence as opposed to the absence of violence. So this means that there is limited information and, as a result, limited understanding of these communities. The evidence suggests, though, that while people are wary of the conflict, they can still organize in important ways, and it raises the question of how many more Maaloulas might exist in Syria, and indeed in other conflicts as well. However, I think these important examples show that these kinds of movements to try to improve the lives of civilians, make their lives a little bit better and more stable in very fluctuating conflict, that it can be done, that this is actually a possibility. It may not be a possibility everywhere, as we've seen from some of the intense conflict conditions, but some communities under some conditions can take positive action. Now, one last caveat is that causality and drawing tight lines of causality between civilian organization and reduced violence is obviously a very challenging task. In Syria, it's an extremely challenging task because there has historically been much less data available to do really tightly controlled comparisons. Evidence from other countries suggests that, broadly speaking, this trend holds. It's going to be an interesting question to debate and later try to evaluate whether or not this is the case, whether or not civilians actually can take this kind of effective action. So lastly, just to conclude with a policy thought or a policy recommendation, is that to support the locals. So what if we had supported these local communities from the beginning, or done some kind of preventative action so that these communities would be better equipped to deal with armed groups coming to their towns? Perhaps they would have been better able to continue a nonviolent revolution. And the implication, I think, is that international actors should not just be waiting for some kind of consensus to take large actions or large-scale interventions or military no-fly zones, which are complicated and require broad consensus, but instead should think more proactively and preventatively to support communities prior to conflict, during the conflict, and even for post-conflict stability, as is the case with as the local coordinating committees will likely play an important role. So with that, I'm going to finish my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
So now we're going to turn to Kristin Gillespie for her comments.
So this conference is about resolving the Syria crisis. And what I noticed is that no one from the regime is invited. So hopefully that means that they're not part of Syria's future. Especially as I'm in the opposition, and I'm hoping that they're not. That's what I've been working for many months. I left Jordan on Tuesday, 2 days ago. And before I left, I asked the Syrians I worked with what they wanted me to tell you all at this conference, because what I want to do is to sort of convey their voice, because they don't speak English, because they're not as educated as the people we see in the news, what they wanted you to know. And what they wanted you to know is that they want the U.S. to do something, because what they're seeing now is what they consider a conspiracy. They can't possibly believe that the U.S. just doesn't have a plan. There has to be some sort of conspiracy, a Freemason conspiracy, a Zionist conspiracy, a conspiracy to ally with the Muslim Brotherhood, let Syria disintegrate into civil war, arm the Muslim Brotherhood, and then when they come to power, they're going to be the U.S. stooge in the region. I mean, very complicated stuff, but when I keep telling them that, there just isn't a plan. They're just not interested. They're not engaged. They don't feel that there's a strategic value. This doesn't resonate. This doesn't make sense to them, given the Iraq intervention, the Libya intervention, and all the other interventions we see around the world. So they're wondering, why not us? Why can't we get some sort of help? So, okay, what kind of help do you want? Do you want military intervention? No, we want arms. This is vast people I talk to of varying educations and backgrounds. We want arms. Okay, well, the U.S. probably won't arm you anytime soon. We want the U.S. to pressure Russia and China to stop arming the Assad regime. Because when those planes are flying over the skies, the opposition doesn't have a chance. Even though they've been commandeering military bases, taking the anti-aircraft weapons and shooting down planes, a lot of them, it still doesn't compare with the firepower that Russia's providing. So I ask you to consider this. What if the US is pressuring Russia and pressuring China and getting nowhere? And that the Russian and Chinese version of the way the world should work is that these tyrannies continue and that countries like ours will do nothing about it. And I think that's what they're banking on. So hopefully this conference will lead us to a different conclusion where we don't have to tell these people that this regime, which has destroyed 3 million buildings across the country, has left hundreds of thousands of people homeless with nothing to go home to. People maimed and shot and tortured and depressed and with nothing, they don't see an end in sight. What do we tell them? So I just ask you to consider that.
Thank you.
On that note.
I just have a couple of quick observations, and then we'll open it up for more of a general discussion as a roundtable, pulling in all of you as well. So the two things that come to mind when I hear our speakers are both have to do with, again, what happens afterwards. And I appreciated Oliver's underlining the role of a selective attention in this conflict and how that's going to continue to play a role unless that's addressed. He mentioned the selective attention by international leadership and how basically the civilian level is not being attended to and other activities are not being attended to. And there was also a mention of the selective attention of the media. And I'd actually look forward to hearing maybe a little bit more from you about how that happens and how it can be countered. Because we haven't heard about some of the examples that Oliver put up, and that tends to be the case in any conflict. And so when we move into post-conflict, and even as we try to get out of the conflict, we often forget the importance of positive models, that if we only have negative models, humans operate on the basis not just of abstract notions of what to do next, but of watching others, and both in terms of watching other individuals and looking at what are the norms suggesting that is the right thing to do here. And so it's very important to have alternative positive models for how people can act differently. And so it clearly is important for us to hear more about some of these positive models of how people are operating together. I appreciated that Kristen raised the question about how does a post-conflict Syria proceed without involving people from the regime. So I guess we'll hear more about that in the next few days. So let me just open it now to not only your questions, but also your comments. I'm going to make a suggestion that you do limit your comments to them being not excessively long, but as a roundtable, this is an opportunity for us to have a little bit more of a discussion than in a traditional panel format. So why don't we start first with anyone that has either a question or a comment. Please, Thomas.
Should I introduce myself?
Please, yes.
Tamra Pearson from the University of Edinburgh. I have three comments for Oliver. First of all, I mean, I don't really like the concept of silent majority, but I don't have the time to explain why. But I'm not sure you can say that the people who have not been killed or displaced are unaffected and belong to the silent majority. Take the province of Aleppo, it's 25% of the Syrian population. Every single major town has been shelled and subject to airstrikes. So even if people have not been killed or displaced, they've been seriously affected. And that's related to that. I'm not sure you can deal with the armed groups and the communities as if they were completely separate things. I mean, there is a massive military mobilization in Syria. I mean, you do not create a 100, we don't know how many fighters the FSA has, but it's quite huge, and it comes from the communities. Yeah, and the third thing, I don't think there is something specific about Christians. I think if we have very few Christians killed, it's because there are very few Christians in Syria. I don't think, I mean, I often see this figure of 10%, but according to demographers, it's much below that. It's maybe below 5%.
5%.
Yeah, 6 is probably, 5, 6 is what, most serious demographers say. And also, most of the civilian victims are Sunnis, so it's absolutely normal that you don't have many Christians among the victims.
Well, that, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I'm
Should I answer those three?
Yeah.
So maybe we can go ahead and take another comment or question on the same point, and then have a conversation about that. Go ahead. So if you want to elaborate on his point.
Yes,
And your name is? I'm sorry.
my name is Osama David. I'm from Syria. and
Okay.
I'm
Okay.
But I go to Syria every year.
Great.
Camp to study the statistics that you mentioned. The Christians, as you said, they're not 10%. They were at 10% before, but they have been decreasing. Many of them left Syria and long time ago. As far as the other thing, you showed one of the chart, and you said the number of people dying are decreasing. That's in the last month. Actually, it's increasing. It's increasing. As far as you said, what the Syrians want. The Syrians, they want arms. They have a plenty of people to fight this regime. The majority of Syrians are Sunni. 80% are Sunni. 75% are Arab Sunni. There's about 5-6% who are Kurds, maybe 8% Kurds are Sunni. But the majority are Sunni. And the Alawi you mentioned is 13%. I don't think you have accurate statistics on that, because the total Alawi is 1.3 million, and the number of Syrians 22 million. So they are about 6, but they are in power. So these statistics are not really accurate.
Okay, so it seems like we have a couple of issues. One that has to do with being affected or not, or if there are varying degrees of being affected. And then the other one having to do with where these statistics are coming from, and how differences in how these might be estimated might have different implications.
Yeah. Check this out. So thank you for those, and I'd be happy to address those. Can everybody hear me? Okay. So in terms of being unaffected, I mean, you're right. A lot of civilians have definitely been affected in, if not killed or displaced, certainly affected in less direct ways. And so that was one estimate. I mean, the question would be, how many civilians are being affected? And a question that we should definitely discuss in this conference is how many civilians are being affected, not directly by violence, but of being shelling in their towns. I mean, is it all Syrians? Is it half of the population? I mean, that's a really important question, I think, to answer. And so I don't have a good answer for that, because that kind of information is not well reported. And so this was one way to approximate that theme. And so, but you definitely raise an important point that there could be more people indirectly affected. The question is, are they still able to get by, even though they've had buildings destroyed in their town, or are living under fear or threat? So that's definitely an important question. The second point you raised was that can you really separate the armed groups from the civilian communities? And that's a completely valid point, because oftentimes both the military as well as an insurgent group or even a paramilitary group are obviously drawn from the population itself. And so this is a very contentious question as to how much civilians themselves can, for example, prevent recruitment into one armed group or another to try to limit the conflict and maintain a peaceful movement. In some cases, community institutions and elders of communities are able to keep younger males, let's say, or would-be fighters from joining armed groups and continuing on a peaceful path. That's not always the case, but the data, for example, that of how many people are in the military or how many people are in the FSA are again very rough estimates, and so we don't really know where people are, where they're coming from. There are certainly a lot of examples of families that have been torn apart where one son is in one side of the conflict, the military, one is on the rebel side, and so there are certainly these deep divisions even within communities. So in terms of some of the data issues, I don't want to take issue with you that these figures are not completely accurate. I think a major problem and part of the problem stemming from this autocratic regime is that information was very closely held and very manipulated. And so in this instance, I did my best to find approximations of demographics and the population sizes of different groups. They may very well be off by several percentage points or more. I don't know if that necessarily, in the case of that, of the estimation of violence against Christians is off because that homicide rate looked so low. Now, that could be a problem because of reporting of violence, which is another question. And again, this comes to the fog of war and being unable to have clear reporting on these conflicts. So it could be that Christians have actually suffered much more than what is shown up there. But likely they would have to be even a much smaller proportion of the population than you suggest for them to have a much higher and in fact comparable homicide rate. So in terms of the decrease in the killings that we saw over time in the recent period, that could be a misrepresentation in the data. It could be that month was not completely counted or miscounted. I haven't been able to verify that source of data, and I was only able to obtain one source of data. I think the more important thing to look at in that graph was the general trend, which you point out, Assam, is it? Usam. That violence has in fact been increasing and intensifying, which does have severe implications for what civilians are able to do in those kinds of contexts. So, yes, sorry.
The violence against children. This regime is specialized in violence against children. Have you anything about it to say?
I myself have not done research on that other than to say that that's an especially atrocious form of violence. Hopefully if communities such as the examples that I've shown are able to manage the sort of the delicate balance of who they're siding with and staying nonviolent, that would be one way to try to avoid retaliation. I don't know how frequently that occurs.
I asked UNICEF as well. I asked UNICEF that exact question because I figured they were the only ones who would know, and they don't know. They just don't have a mechanism for tracking. Yeah. Yeah, actually what happens is, somebody sent me an email last night. What happens in a town is that they'll drop shells. The regime will drop shells. A lot of them will be not loaded. And so children will gather around and start to play with them. And then, of course, they drop a second shell. And one of my friends emailed me last night an example of he told me that one of the men in his village picked up the first shell and ran off with it. So the children followed him because they thought it was a toy. And then the regime dropped a second shell a few seconds later in the same spot. So the scale of the atrocities, the UN just doesn't have the access, unfortunately, and this is, of course, exactly what the regime wants. So if the UN can't get it, anything else is just speculation.
Can you also say a little bit more about your perceptions of to what degree people are affected and in what ways? Kind of addressing that question of people being affected or unaffected.
Yeah, I think at this stage, people are deeply affected. For example, in Jordan, we're not seeing products from Lebanon, rose water, orange flower water, you're familiar with these, They're not in the stores anymore. Syrian glass is no longer in the stores. The borders are largely closed. And this is affecting trade in Lebanon, it's affecting trade in Jordan. And inside Syria, factories are closed, exports aren't happening, and the squeeze is on. Everybody's being squeezed in every way. My best friend is a teacher in a UN camp, in Yabrood camp in Damascus. She's been out of work for many months. Her home was destroyed. She's been displaced 3 times within the country. She asked me to try to get her out. I can't because she's half Palestinian. She has Palestinian papers, not a Syrian passport. So I told her just stay where you are and hope for the best. Another friend, there was a massacre in his town last week, Mleha, outside Damascus. 65 people were killed. That was unreported. I just wanted to make a comment about minorities because it's sort of this mix of we don't really understand what's happening. Christians are not being targeted, okay? Not by the FSA and not by the regime. Why? Because they're considered harmless in a way. Everybody in Syria understands that Christians are good for society. They bring diversity, they're excellent traders, they have great relations with everybody, they really have no enemies. And the regime has tried to make it look like all of the Christians are with them. But there are a lot of people who are afraid to come out and say they're not. And I have talked to Christians who are against the regime, who are actively fighting it. Some are in uniform, some aren't. But the Assad regime got what it wanted. It didn't want the minorities to join this fight. It wanted a showdown between Alawis and Sunnis, and it did everything they could to set it up that way. Peaceful protests were not what the regime wanted, because Alawis could join, Christians could join, and then that would undermine the sectarian theme that the Assads have been trying to set up from the beginning. So the protests were largely peaceful, and this was the Assad nightmare. Now, once over Ramadan, they invaded Hama. They bombed the square, and that was the last chance for a peaceful uprising. After that, everybody had to arm, and now we're in this apocalyptic nightmare. But the regime got the revolution that it wanted. It realized the myth that it has been propagating from the beginning, that these are armed terrorists. They're not. There were civilians who have been arrested for many months, and the minorities themselves are largely leaderless. The Assad regime will not allow them to have strong leaders because they want to control them. And the one leader we saw, the Kurdish leader, Michel Tamo, he was executed last year, and we don't know by whom. It could have been anybody, the regime, radical Islamists, radical Kurds, no one knows, but the one strong leader of the minority community was gone. The Druze have no leader, the Shiites have no leader, the Christian leaders have been co-opted by the regime, so.
Okay, so we have another question or comment over here, please.
Yes, my name is Aleppo Today. I have a question again about the statistics because when we say 83% unaffected, in Syria approximately we have 800,000 cities, more than 600,000 cities being affected by shelling, by of course, by the battle and all of that. This is why I think we have
So, so some comments on the data that the UN data seems to be the most well-checked data because they've compared a number of data sources, and in fact they are able to attribute, I think, numbers of victims by age. So some of that information about minors who have been killed could be obtainable. I don't know it off the top of my head, but I think they have in that report they have some graphs. Sir, I'm sorry, I don't know what organization you were referring to.
The Syrian network.
The Syrian network? Okay.
Network for Human Rights.
Network for Human Rights, okay. So, I mean, undoubtedly there are a lot of people counting the human rights violations that are going on. The question is, of course, how complete is each source and what coverage does it have, and how can they be verified? No doubt the numbers are very high, and in no doubt many civilians have been, as I said, directly or indirectly affected. I was trying to put up numbers there of people that had been directly affected as opposed to people who had been either unaffected or indirectly affected in some way, which is a much harder number to calculate. But I don't want to pretend that this conflict is not severe. It is very severe, and I think the numbers show that. The point that I was trying to make was that, as well as that, there are apparent examples where some civilians have tried to deal with it in somewhat constructive ways. The Christian populations are obviously an interesting case. I think Kristen, raised an interesting point about what are the motivations of the regime towards these groups? Why are they not victims? Is the opposition able to incorporate these populations into their movement or not? So.
And we're clearly seeing that another aspect of this conflict is conflict over information, right?
Yes.
I mean, in fact, it would be interesting to speculate on if there would be a way to increase using mechanisms like the one that you allowed. Did you say YouTube is one of the ways that these are documented, sir?
Yes.
Yeah, they're
With
posted on
YouTube?
Yeah.
So and looking at other conflicts where social media has been used to track movements and casualties and the importance of that, seeing if there would be a way to increase that. So.
Yeah. The UN report, actually, they don't have any statistics. They collect information from 5 organizations. Actually, 3 organizations, they have one source, which is our source. But Syrian Shuhada website, actually, that's being trafficked. And the Syrian network and the Damascus Center, and they rely on the Syrian government. But the Syrian government, although the fifth source, the Syrian government, only they give numbers. They don't have names, they don't have where places being affected. Or this is why actually even that the UN has to be more revisited on this.
Can you say a little bit more about how you're using Skype?
Oh, yeah. So I work for this opposition channel. It's not Aleppo Today. Aleppo Today, by the way, has no images. It's just not a blank screen, but it's a screen, and it has like text messages that it streams across, almost a crawl. And it's a forum where people are warning each other and explaining to each other where the bombs are falling. It's based out of Turkey, and it's, I think, a Syrian from the diaspora who made his money in the UAE who funds that, and he does it at great personal risk to himself. And it's an excellent source of information about what's happening inside Aleppo. It is only in Arabic, though. But the channel I work for is a fully functioning television channel with images and reports, and it's people-driven. And what we do is we have about 200 people inside Syria, and they're trusted and vetted, and we know who they are. There have been many attempts at infiltration by regime flunkies, and more than 24 people have been killed and tortured by the regime in the line of duty trying to get footage to us. They're all over the country. They're in Deir ez-Zor, Homs, Aleppo, everywhere, and they post videos that they take with their own cell phones. They upload them on portable satellites called BGANs. So even when the regime cuts the internet, they can still get access. They still upload, and everything gets posted into this newsroom on Skype. And I'm the only non-Syrian in there, and it's very interesting because I see the war the way they see it now. I mean, when I read in the American papers, I don't recognize that. So what they're seeing is something totally different, and the situation is more desperate because it's their lives, their homes, their families, and they're being destroyed every day. And as far as they're concerned, no one's doing anything about it. When I ask Syrians how many people support the regime, how many people support Assad, how many people support the FSA, nobody knows. Nobody has a handle on it because of the fractured communication structure. Even the FSA doesn't communicate with each other. It's a very regional structure. So what they're doing in the Northwest is one thing, what they're doing in the South is another, and they don't have lines of communication for various reasons.
Interesting. Other questions? Yes.
This is for Kristen. You had spoken about the resistance kind of view on, I guess, American inaction.
Yeah.
And, you know, I guess the questioning of the motives for, you know, the inaction. What is their role, or what is their view of Russia's motives?
They had a protest several months ago, and you know, each Friday they name the protests the Friday of whatever. It was the Friday of Russia as the enemy of the Syrian people. So Russia is considered the top enemy of the Syrian people at this point. And if and when the regime falls, I really doubt there will be very good relations with Russia. They see Russia as the primary supplier and backer, even more so than Iran. You might have thought Iran, but it is Russia. So, sorry? Yeah, so they just don't understand how the Assad regime can gain so much backing and the rebels can't get backing at all. And as Mr. Osama pointed out, they want arms, they need arms, and the US policy is to not arm them. So, but there are ways to work around that. But doing nothing is becoming more of a problem because what we're seeing is concerns about the Islamization of the Free Syrian Army. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, they're actually buying battalions within the Free Syrian Army. They're purchasing them, and they're making the men grow beards, and they're making them pray, and they're making them do things that are foreign to their own traditions. So to say that there's no strategic value in Syria right now doesn't make sense to me because of these things that are happening in the FSA, and they want our help, and they don't want to go this route, but they don't have a choice.
Yes, please.
So you both mentioned, obviously, that some kind of international intervention or some kind of international aid is more and more necessary. And keeping in mind all the information problems that we've discussed, and Oliver, you mentioned that citizen support is what this intervention should probably look like. How do you see that playing out in the future, and what will that support be, and who might it be from, and what forms might it take, and how will the international community avoid blowback on the citizens by the regime?
That's a good and that's a good and complicated question. So, what can international actors do to work with communities? I think it's well, in theory, part of why I bring that recommendation up is that in theory it should be less controversial to supply that kind of support in Syria than the kind of military support and weapons that so far outsiders, mostly the United States, but other Western countries have been very reluctant to supply. I don't know tons about this, but I have seen some news reports of some foreign governments, I think like Turkey and possibly Qatar, providing support for particular communities that have, for example, that have been in liberated zones to provide resources for the construction of their own local councils and that kind of thing, so that the civilians in those areas are in control, making political decisions, and not the armed groups or rebel groups or whoever's there. So.
But if I could just follow up on that, just to ask if there aren't any dangers, or what might be the dangers in having external aid be what is supporting communities like that?
What would be the danger to those communities of getting that aid?
Mm-hmm.
Well, what would be the danger to the communities?
And maybe you can speak from your experience in Colombia as well.
I mean, a lot of the aid in Colombia, for example, was not forthcoming, so oftentimes communities had to deal on their own. In some cases, at least, for example, when aid has come from national governments, that can produce some clientelistic relationships and political dependencies. It's not clear. I mean, I think it would depend on what the donor relationships look like, and you know, outside aid of any kind can have a corrupting influence on particular leaders, who then use that kind of resource to buy favors among particular residents. So there is a corrupting possibility. On the other hand, the question is, well, is it better to risk that than to have these communities possibly governed or overrun or strong-armed by people carrying guns? So.
But Assad has diverted 70% of the aid that's been sent into Syria. He's taken it for himself, so that increases the desperation and isolation of people inside. I mean, I met some woman last week in Amman, and she's like 23, 25, and she's a widow. Her husband was the head of the Red Crescent in Homs, and he was targeted by the regime 6 months ago and killed. She's a widow with 3 children, their house destroyed. She's in Amman, suitcase, 3 kids. You know, so many stories like that. So what people are doing on the ground is trying to help each other, but when you have no water, electricity, the bread ovens are being bombed, it just squeezes everything harder.
So please.
I want to say that something. This regime is so brutal, and Syria possesses chemical weapons, and I don't think this regime will hesitate when it is desperate to use the chemical weapons. In fact, there has been evidence that some form of chemical weapons has been used, such as Agent 15. There are some chemical weapons placed in bombs ready to be used. This is a very, very criminal regime.
Agreed.
Agreed.
So maybe we have time for one more question or comment. Yes, please.
Yeah, it's again related to this issue of relation between fighters and communities. I wonder if we can have different configurations according to the resources that are available. Because I heard you're a specialist of Colombia, where, as far as I know, there are some obvious sources of money.
Yeah. Various.
Which I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not a specialist of
Yeah.
this issue, but maybe can produce some kind of armed groups that are kind of survive without being actually well entrenched in local communities because they have money anyway. Whereas I think in Syria is not the case because there's no money.
Yeah. So at least in the case of Colombia, you do have different groups. Some that are more resource dependent, some that are more dependent on communities, and so some that are resource dependent or rely on resources often become more criminalistic and less dependent on communities. And those fronts, for example, tend to be not necessarily highly violent, but very callous in their use of violence because they don't have any connection and don't need the civilians much. The groups that are highly dependent on civilians for resources or whatever, often they're in controlled zones where they have control, but they also tend to be groups that are sort of more ideological as opposed to criminal, and for that reason have some internal restraints on their use of violence. And so in that case, the civilians and the insurgent groups, probably in a lot of the liberated areas, for example, the FSA is not committing a lot of abuses, and the civilians are civilian mobilization perhaps isn't as necessary as it might be outside of those zones. In areas where you have sort of mixed groups is where the civilians, I think, themselves have the biggest role to play. So you have actors that rely somewhat on civilians, may sometimes take them into account, but also do have outside revenue streams or perhaps have criminal tendencies, or some people in the group or particular leaders are highly violent or criminal, but not everybody is. In some of those cases, you see the civilians having more of an influential role to rein those groups in. So in Syria, as you mentioned, I don't know if those conditions are present because the regime is so brutal. And I mean, I guess I should put it this way. It's a very interesting question among the various groups, rebel groups that are operating in Syria. Which ones would perhaps be violent, more violent towards civilians, and where civilians might play a constructive role in dialoguing with them? I don't know. And in fact, the counts for violence against civilians perpetrated by the rebel groups is also not well counted. So people say it's low, but I really, I have no basis to say how severe that kind of indiscipline is. So, but that's a great question. So
I'm actually going to take the chair's prerogative and ask one last question that has to do with this dearth of information that we seem to be focusing on. And I'm wondering if both of you could, maybe Kristen, address from the perspective of a journalist, what are some of the strategies that you could see could get more information out, and what is that dynamic that prevents that information from getting covered? And Oliver, you clearly were able to track down some information, so some information is out there, but we're not necessarily hearing about it. So maybe if you could speak a little bit to those strategies as well.
The dynamic that prevented me from going into Syria last month was Richard Engel's kidnapping, the NBC correspondent. He was told that he would have access to the kidnapped Iranians who were posing as pilgrims. They were actually the Revolutionary Guard. The FSA kidnapped, they hijacked their bus and took them in August. So Richard was ambushed and targeted deliberately. That's one big problem. The other problem is that the regime has been killing journalists, most notably Marie Colvin, who was an amazing war correspondent that I saw in many places and certainly knew her stuff and did not take stupid risks. And she was targeted as well. And what happened to her is beyond gruesome. She was shelled. A Syrian guy posted the scene on YouTube afterwards. It was horrific. And other French and international journalists have been targeted. There was even a French journalist who went in on an official visa who died, and we actually think that the regime set that up. They invited a bunch of foreign journalists in and then killed one to send a message. That's part of the problem. Another part of the problem is the complexity of the Syrian model. I don't feel you can compare it to any other country in the region. I don't feel you can compare this war to any other country or any other experience in the region. The brutality is a scale that we have not seen in any Arab country at all. So if you go there, you're taking a huge risk. You could get caught kidnapped by thugs in the northwest. You could get killed by the regime. You could get killed in crossfire. And a lot of, you also need to know Arabic to function inside Syria. I mean, people don't speak a lot of English, so that becomes a problem as well, just blending in.
Thanks.
Well, I mean, just to reemphasize the point is that we don't, the stories that we don't know are the ones we don't know, so we get this selective reporting on particular events, which, and those events obviously inform our understanding in an important way, but it's also hard to know sort of what part of the story we're not seeing. One thing that I was trying to do here was to try to put together as much as I could on a single topic and sort of constructively figure out if there are any kinds of patterns, and probably that kind of work of pattern detecting, whether it's on nonviolence, violence, other other kinds of tendencies in the conflict, could be resources, aid to civilians, whatever that is. The more complete a picture we can get, the better off we'll be, I think. So.
Well, I think both of you have delivered important comments that have encouraged us to look deeper, look more deeply, I should say. And so as we go forward into the next day, I think you've raised some interesting topics and some good issues for us to consider, and I hope that you'll join me in thanking our speakers.